When I saw the way he looked at me across the breakfast table that morning, I knew something was off. Not the usual tiredness in his eyes, not the distracted nods or the routine kindness he offered like spare change. No, this was something deeper. He asked me if I had plans for the week, but it wasn't a real question. It was a fishing line, cast casually. I answered, pretending not to notice the tension under his tone. Just thinking of going to the sea house, I said. He nodded, but I saw his jaw tighten. That was the moment I realized he might know. Or worse, he felt. Felt what had changed in me. Felt that for weeks now I was elsewhere, somewhere far from our bed, from our routines, from the silence that had become louder than any fight we ever had. He didn't look at me again that morning. And I didn't dare ask what was wrong. Because 3 weeks ago, I made a mistake. A mistake that didn't look like a mistake at the time, it looked like oxygen. And now, I'm going to tell you how it all began. But before I do, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from, and have you ever crossed a line in your life, thinking it was just a shadow, only to realize it was the edge of everything you thought was safe? The Sea House had always been a place of retreat for us, a 2-story home with peeling white shutters and a garden full of mint that grew too wild in the spring. We'd bought it years ago, back when things between us still felt like unfolding, not maintenance. He used to read on the porch with his feet up, and I'd bring out fresh fruit and coffee like it was a ritual we'd created, just the two of us. But this time, he didn't come with me. He claimed work. Deadlines. I didn't argue. Maybe because part of me was relieved. The silence in the car on the way there was a different kind of silence. Not marital silence, the kind you learn to live with after years. This was a quiet space that felt like a pause between two heartbeats. I drove with the window down, let the air whip at my face, and didn't play music. My thoughts were enough noise. I didn't know he would already be there. I found his backpack at the foot of the stairs before I saw him. A navy canvas thing with a broken zipper, I recognized it immediately. My friend's son. 21. Supposedly staying a few days before heading south for a summer internship. I hadn't known the schedule. No one told me. He came out of the kitchen holding a cup of tea like he owned the place. Tall, sunburned at the nose, wearing an old gray shirt and barefoot. Didn't think you'd be here this early, he said. Not surprised. Just calm. Like we had met here before. I didn't know you'd be here, I answered. There was a second of awkwardness, the kind that you don't notice until your heart starts doing something it shouldn't. He shrugged. Hope it's okay. I'll be gone in a few days. It's fine, I said too quickly. And that was the first lie. We moved around each other for the next day like dancers on an unfamiliar floor. I stayed mostly outside, watering the plants, trimming the herbs, pretending not to glance toward the kitchen window when he passed by. He was always moving. Setting things right. Fixing the screen door. Cleaning out the old garden shed. Sweating in a way that made me remember something about my own skin, how it used to respond to heat. Not just sun, but proximity. Attraction. That night, I lay awake in the upstairs room that still smelled of lavender. I could hear him walking downstairs. Could imagine him barefoot, reading on the sofa, maybe drinking something cold. And I hated that I was imagining anything at all. The next morning, I wore the dress. Not for him. I told myself that again and again. But I hadn't worn it in 2 summers. It was a faded navy wrap, just soft enough to move when I walked, just fitted enough to remind me that I still had a shape under the loose shirts and careful blouses. I caught his eyes when I came down the stairs. He looked, quickly, then away. Polite. Respectful. But I saw it. He offered to help with the market run. I agreed before thinking. We drove in silence most of the way, but not uncomfortable silence. Shared silence. Like we were both pretending not to notice that something had cracked open. At the market, I reached for the same bunch of peaches he did, and our hands brushed. I flinched. He didn't. He smiled. "Sorry," he said. I mumbled something about coincidence, but the truth is, nothing about that moment felt accidental. Later, back at the house, we unpacked the groceries. He opened the kitchen window wide, let the sea air rush in, and I felt the dress tug against my skin. I turned away, pretended to reorganize the fruit bowl, my heart doing things I hadn't allowed it to do in years. I caught myself humming. I never hum. In the evening, he offered to take the compost out, and I offered to come with. I don't know why. Maybe because it felt less like sneaking when we both went. Maybe because I needed to see the stars, some proof that the world was still solid. We stood behind the house, beside the garden shed, under the night sky. He said something about constellations. I didn't listen. My pulse was too loud. He turned to me, and there it was again. That look. That not looking away. I almost stepped back. Almost laughed it off. But I didn't. I said goodnight and walked quickly to the house. Locked the door behind me. Leaned against it, palms flat. What was happening? In the mirror above the dresser, I saw myself differently. Not beautiful, not young, but real. Awake. And that scared me more than anything. Because it wasn't about him. Not really. It was about the fact that I remembered how to feel. And that meant something had already begun. The next morning came slowly, with a sky that hovered in indecision, neither bright nor overcast, just an endless gray that seemed to mirror the uncertainty stirring inside me. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to see him again. Or rather, I didn't trust what would happen if I did. The sounds of the house were different when he was in it. There was movement, the kind I hadn't felt in years. The quiet shifting of drawers, the distant hum of the kettle, the soft rhythm of someone whistling, a melody I didn't recognize, but that stayed with me even after it stopped. I got dressed without much thought. Jeans. A long linen shirt. Barefoot. I avoided mirrors. Avoided questions. When I walked downstairs, he was already on the porch, sitting on the old swing with a book in his lap. He looked up and smiled, just for a second. It wasn't loaded, not flirtatious, just present. And something in that startled me more than if he had said anything suggestive. I made tea, moving slowly, deliberately, as if each step required approval. When I brought the mug outside, he moved aside to give me space on the bench. I almost sat across from him, but something, stubbornness, pride, fear, told me to sit beside him. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though I could feel the air between us humming with everything unsaid. Out of nowhere, he asked me what it was like to be married for decades. Not as a joke, not sarcastically. Just honestly. I answered without turning to him. I said it was like learning a language together, building a shared vocabulary of gestures, tones, routines, and then one day realizing that you're the only one still speaking it fluently. That the other person now prefers silence. Or another language entirely. I didn't mean to say so much. I don't know if he understood all of it, but he nodded, thoughtfully. That was enough. The hours passed strangely that day. I cleaned the windows. I swept the floors. I rearranged books that hadn't been touched in years. Every now and then, I'd glance outside and see him, barefoot in the garden, pulling weeds, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. I kept telling myself he was just a guest. A visitor. Temporary. By late afternoon, the clouds finally broke, and golden light spilled across the porch. I stood at the window, watching him gather some lemons that had dropped from the tree. His arms were tanned, stronger than I remembered from last summer, and the way he moved, grounded, casual, reminded me of something I hadn't allowed myself to think about in a long time. Not lust. Not desire. But the ache of being noticed. The electricity of being seen, not for what I provide or manage, but for who I am beneath the layers of role and routine. I didn't realize how long I'd been watching him until he turned, saw me at the window, and smiled. I looked away quickly, but it was too late. He came in shortly after, holding 3 small lemons in one hand. "Thought we could use these for dinner," he said. I nodded, thankful for the excuse to move, to speak, to reset whatever had just happened in that glance. We cooked together, awkwardly at first. I chopped garlic while he sliced vegetables. Our elbows bumped once, and we both said sorry at the same time. We laughed. It broke something, not in a damaging way, but like cracking a window open after years of stale air. We ate outside on the porch, using mismatched plates and drinking water with lemon slices. The breeze was cool, and the light from the horizon turned everything a soft gold. He told me about his classes. His plans. A road trip he wanted to take. I listened more than I spoke. I liked the way he talked, not to impress, not to prove anything, but with the openness of someone who didn't carry decades of layers on his back. After dinner, I cleaned up while he sat at the table sketching something in a small notebook. I didn't ask what. I was afraid it might be me. Later, just before sunset, he suggested walking down to the rocks by the water. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I did. Still, I agreed. We walked in silence, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. The air was cooler now, filled with salt and the faint scent of seaweed. When we reached the rocks, he climbed ahead, offering a hand when I hesitated at a slippery edge. I took it. His hand was warm. Firm. Familiar in a way that shouldn't have been possible. We sat side by side, our knees nearly touching. The sky turned pink and orange above us. I tried to focus on the waves, on the rhythm of the sea, on anything that didn't involve the electricity I felt sitting next to him. He turned to me, and before I could process it, before I could rationalize or retreat, we kissed. Just that. No fireworks. No dramatic music. Just the press of his lips against mine, gentle and tentative, like a question he already knew the answer to. We kissed. And when it ended, we didn't speak. We walked back quietly, without touching. Not avoiding each other. Just wrapped in the enormity of what had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second. Not with guilt. Not yet. Just with shock. Because something had shifted. Something that couldn't be undone. I told myself it was a moment. A mistake. A slip. But the truth settled differently in my chest. It hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt like breathing. The morning after the kiss, I moved slower than usual, as if the weight of the night still clung to my limbs. I washed my face twice, hoping cold water would rinse away the memory, the heat, the silence that followed. But it didn't. Nothing did. The moment had happened, and it lingered, not just in my body, but in the corners of the house, in the rhythm of my breath, in the tightness behind my ribs. Downstairs, I avoided looking toward the kitchen, even though I knew he would be there. I could hear him before I saw him, opening cabinets, clinking ceramic, the soft scuff of his heels against the wood floor. These sounds, once neutral, now carried weight. Now they said, he is still here, and so is what you did. I poured my tea without a word. He glanced at me, just briefly, and I nodded, acknowledging his presence but giving nothing else. I didn't trust my voice, didn't trust the way it might tremble, betray something I hadn't figured out how to name. The kitchen felt smaller today. The ceiling lower. Every shared space now seemed like a stage, and I didn't know the script. He broke the silence, gently, asking if I needed help with anything that day. I said no. My tone was firm, distant. Not angry, not cold, just careful. I could tell he noticed. He nodded once and returned to his cup, saying nothing more. We spent most of the morning avoiding each other. I went outside, pretending to care about weeds that had long since won the war in the garden. I clipped dead blossoms, wiped off dusty leaves, and pulled at vines with more force than necessary. I needed something to do with my hands. My thoughts were already too loud. Inside, he moved around quietly. I heard the sound of a vacuum, then the clatter of pans. He was cleaning. I should have felt grateful, but all I felt was crowded by his presence, by his kindness, by my own unbearable awareness of how long it had been since someone had simply looked at me and seen a woman, not a habit. By midday, the tension had stretched too thin. I told him I was going into town to get groceries. He offered to come, but I declined. I needed space, or the illusion of it. I needed to remind myself who I was before all this began. The drive helped, but only a little. The town was small, familiar, and full of couples, old ones walking hand in hand, young ones arguing over fruit. I watched them with a sense of disconnection, as though I were underwater, observing from some other world. At the store, I found myself lingering near the wine, staring too long at a label I wasn't going to buy. I thought about the nights my husband and I used to drink together, talk for hours, fall asleep with our feet tangled. I thought about how those nights had vanished, not in one dramatic swoop, but in quiet, forgettable steps. Like erosion. Like rust. Driving back, the sky darkened slightly, clouds pulling over the sun like a half-hearted curtain. I rolled the window down and let the wind tangle my hair. It felt better to be messy. More honest. When I returned, the house was quiet. Too quiet. His shoes were still by the door, but I didn't see him. I unpacked slowly, pausing at each item as if it were part of a ritual. Apples. Bread. Milk. Nothing could ground me, but I kept trying. I found him outside later, sitting on the back steps, sketchbook open on his knee. He didn't hear me approach. I watched for a moment, observing the way his head tilted slightly, the concentration in his brow. There was something peaceful about him, something I hadn't expected to find in someone so young. I cleared my throat, and he turned. He closed the notebook quickly, as if embarrassed. I didn't ask what he was drawing. I didn't want to know. I didn't mean to make things strange, he said quietly. I looked away. They were already strange. He nodded. Still. I'm sorry. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Apologies wouldn't undo anything, and pretending otherwise would insult both of us. That night, I ate alone in the kitchen while he stayed in his room. The walls felt thicker. The silence deeper. I kept checking my phone, expecting a message from my husband, but there was none. He rarely called when he traveled now. Said the time zones were too annoying, or he was too tired, or he didn't want to wake me. I used to believe him. Maybe part of me still did. I sat by the window after dinner, watching the sky turn charcoal. The trees swayed, their branches writing invisible scripts in the air. I remembered being 21. Remembered how everything felt possible then. Dangerous, but thrilling. I hadn't been that woman in a long time. And yet, something in me had stirred. Not because of him, but because of what he'd mirrored back to me. A hunger I thought I had buried. A need not just for touch, but for aliveness. I couldn't sleep again. The hours dragged. I listened to the old pipes groan, the wind rattle the shutters, a dog barking somewhere far down the hill. I tried reading, but the words swam on the page. I tried meditating, but my thoughts tangled like thread. At some point, I found myself standing in the hallway, outside his door. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds? Minutes? Long enough to hear him shift in his bed. Long enough to hate myself a little. I turned and went back to my room. The mirror caught me again. Same face, same eyes. But there was a light behind them now. Not joy. Not sadness. Something harder to name. Something more dangerous. The next day would come, and with it, decisions. But for now, I stood alone in the dark, listening to my heartbeat, and knew that whatever I had stepped into, I couldn't step out of it unchanged. The day began with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The sky was a muted white, the kind of pale that never decided between rain or sun. I got out of bed later than usual, ignoring the faint ache behind my eyes and the tightness in my chest that had become too familiar these past few days. I didn't know what I wanted. I only knew I couldn't keep pretending nothing had happened. I found him in the garden, kneeling in the soil, his hands covered in earth, sleeves rolled up. He looked calm, focused, unaware of the storm that churned inside me. I stood in the doorway for a while, watching him pull weeds with a rhythm that was both mechanical and graceful. I wondered if he had slept at all. I certainly hadn't. I stayed inside most of the morning, occupying myself with pointless tasks. I wiped down the kitchen counters 3 times. Rearranged the same drawer twice. The house felt both too quiet and too loud, every creak in the wood, every shifting gust of wind outside seemed to mock me. My thoughts wandered constantly, circling the same questions I refused to answer. Why did I let it happen? Why did I want it to? After lunch, I took a walk alone. I needed to be away from him, away from the house, from the ghost of that kiss that seemed to linger in every corner. The sea wasn't far, and I followed the familiar trail that led through the back of the property, across a field, and down to the cliff path. The wind picked up as I walked. It pushed against my body, tugging at my shirt, pulling strands of hair across my face. I didn't fight it. There was something almost comforting about its insistence, its lack of hesitation. It reminded me of how long it had been since I'd let anything move me without resistance. The cliffs overlooked the water in a way that always stole my breath, no matter how many times I'd stood there. Below, the sea churned gently against the rocks, rhythmic and timeless. I sat on a bench half buried in overgrown grass and stared at the horizon, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. I thought about the life I had built. About the man I had built it with. We had shared years, homes, a child. We had survived arguments, relocations, illnesses, and the slow erosion of passion. I never stopped loving him, not truly, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling seen. And that was the root of it. Not the kiss. Not the boy. Not even the guilt. It was the terrifying realization that I had vanished in my own life. That I had become a fixture, reliable, familiar, invisible. When I returned to the house, the sun had broken through the clouds. Warm light spilled across the porch, painting long shadows across the wooden floor. I paused before opening the door, taking a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever followed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and citrus. He was in the living room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by books he'd pulled from the shelves. I didn't ask what he was doing. I didn't want to interrupt the quiet energy he carried. He looked up and offered a small smile. I returned it, not out of politeness, but because I meant it. I went for a walk, I said, more to say something than to inform. I figured, he replied. I didn't want to disturb you. We stood there for a moment, facing each other across the room, neither of us knowing what came next. It wasn't awkward. It was simply uncharted. Later, after dinner, simple pasta, barely eaten, we found ourselves outside again. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the trees and turning the edges of the house to fire. I leaned against the railing of the porch, watching the world dim around me. He joined me, careful to leave space between us. I should be leaving soon, he said after a while. I nodded. You have plans? Kind of. But I think it's better. For both of us. I didn't disagree. But I didn't confirm it either. The truth was, I didn't know what was better anymore. That night, I pulled out an old box of letters. They'd been tucked away in the back of a closet, untouched for years. Letters my husband had written me in the early days, before phones, before email, when words were still ink on paper and held weight. I read through them slowly, my fingers trembling slightly with every page. The words were tender, loving, filled with hope and admiration. But something about them felt distant now, like they had been written to someone I no longer was. Or maybe to someone he no longer remembered. In one letter, he had written, "You are the ocean to me, beautiful, unpredictable, always moving." I remembered how that made me feel at the time, wanted, mysterious, alive. Now, I felt none of those things. And I couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at me as if I was anything but dependable. I sat with those letters for a long time. Not crying. Not angry. Just still. Trying to find myself in his words and failing. Eventually, I stood up and carried the box to the fireplace. I hesitated, then placed the letters back in their envelope and left them on the mantel. I wasn't ready to burn them. But I wasn't ready to keep pretending either. I went to bed with the windows open. The wind moved through the room gently, like breath, like possibility. I heard him moving around downstairs, getting ready for sleep. I didn't go to him. He didn't come to me. But the air between us had changed. And I knew that no matter what happened next, we were both already different. Not because of what we'd done. But because of what we'd allowed ourselves to feel. The next morning arrived with startling clarity. Sunlight poured through the windows in crisp angles, slicing the room into strips of gold and shadow. I blinked against the brightness, pulled the sheet around myself, and listened. The house was still. No footsteps, no water running, no dishes clinking. Just the distant sound of gulls and the steady rhythm of the wind moving through the trees. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything was normal again. That I had dreamed the past few days. That there hadn't been a kiss on the rocks, or that it hadn't meant anything. But the memory rose quickly, vivid and unrelenting, and with it came the weight I had tried to sleep away. I showered, moving slowly, methodically. The steam fogged the mirror and softened my reflection, which I welcomed. I didn't want to look at myself too clearly. Not yet. My skin felt sensitive, as though the air carried meaning it hadn't before. Even brushing my fingers through my hair felt heavier somehow. Downstairs, I found him in the kitchen. He was standing by the stove, boiling water, and his back was to me. For a moment, I just watched him. The quietness of his posture, the deliberate way he moved. I wondered if he had rehearsed what to say, or if he, like me, was hoping that the silence could stretch long enough to become safety again. He turned and offered a soft good morning. I returned it. My voice sounded even, calm. I was grateful for that. We didn't talk much. We sat at the table, each of us nursing tea that cooled faster than we drank it. Every now and then, our eyes met, but only for a second. There was no anger, No shame, only the kind of awkward intimacy that follows something too important to ignore but too fragile to confront. After breakfast, I retreated to the garden. The lavender had grown wild around the edges, and the rosemary bush had nearly doubled in size. I pulled on gloves and began cutting back the overgrowth, more for distraction than necessity. My hands moved with practiced ease, but my mind was a storm. Why had I let it happen again? What did it mean, really? I didn't have the answers. I only knew that the moment hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt like a yes to something unnamed. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not passion, exactly. Not rebellion. Something more delicate. More dangerous. Later in the day, I heard the door shut and turned to see him walking toward the car. He stopped when he saw me, hesitated, then approached slowly. "I was going to get some things from town," he said. "Do you need anything?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." He nodded and walked away. I watched him drive off, a small part of me surprised by the quiet relief I felt. The space between us had grown tight, almost unbearable. His absence gave me room to breathe, but it didn't silence the questions. While he was gone, I moved through the house with unfamiliar purpose. I gathered old clothes from drawers, straightened photos on the walls, wiped down windows I had ignored for months. I moved like someone preparing for something they couldn't name. Eventually, I returned to the small drawer in the bedroom that held the old letters. I didn't open them again. Instead, I pulled out a notebook. Blank pages. Fresh. I opened to the first page and began to write, not to him, not to my husband, but to myself. I wrote about the silence. The hunger. The way I had shrunk into myself over the years without even noticing. I wrote about the dinner plates, the bedtime routines, the way my husband stopped kissing me on the mouth. I wrote about the breeze on my skin the night of the kiss, and how alive it made me feel, and how frightened that feeling had become. I didn't cry. The words came easily, without force. I filled pages until my hand cramped. And when I finished, I closed the notebook gently and placed it on the dresser like something sacred. When he returned, it was nearly sunset. I was sitting on the porch, barefoot, a glass of water resting beside me. He came up the steps slowly, quietly, as though unsure if he was still welcome in the same way. He sat across from me, not speaking at first. The light around us dimmed gradually, the sky changing from amber to dusky blue. I could hear the ocean in the distance, constant and unbothered. After some time, he spoke. "I've been thinking about leaving tomorrow." I nodded. That might be best. Neither of us said what we both knew, that things had crossed a line, and even if we never crossed it again, we had still left something behind. "I didn't mean to confuse you," he added. "You didn't," I said, and meant it. He looked at me with something between apology and gratitude. "You made me feel real." I wanted to tell him he had done the same. But I didn't. Not out of cruelty, but because it didn't need to be said. Some truths are quieter when left unsaid. Some connections don't need to be carried into the next chapter. They just need to be acknowledged. We sat in silence until the first star appeared. Then he stood, nodded once, and went inside. I remained on the porch long after he had gone. The night thickened, and the wind picked up. I pulled a shawl around my shoulders and closed my eyes. I wasn't looking for anything anymore. Not justification. Not romance. Not clarity. What I had found was simpler than that. Presence. A reminder that I existed. That I still responded to the world around me, to words, to touch, to silence. And even if this was all it ever became, it had been enough to wake me up. I woke to the sound of soft rain tapping against the windows, the kind that doesn't rush you out of bed but rather invites you to stay beneath the covers just a little longer. I lay there, eyes open, listening. The silence in the house was different now. Still quiet, but with a hollow to it, as if something had been taken out and not put back. I got up slowly, wrapped a sweater around myself, and padded downstairs barefoot. The kitchen was empty. His bag was gone from the hallway. The shoes he always left near the door weren't there. My heart thudded once, heavily. He had left early, then. Quietly, just as he said he might. I didn't blame him. Still, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the empty space where his things had been, and I felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't sadness exactly. Not regret either. Just the unmistakable feeling of an ending. I made tea, not out of need but out of habit. The smell of mint and honey filled the kitchen, mingling with the dampness from the open window. I sat at the table, watching the rain fall in long, graceful streaks against the garden path. The world felt softer under the rain, blurred at the edges, as if it, too, didn't know what came next. At some point, I noticed the envelope on the table. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for a long time, fingers brushing the edge. Part of me feared it would be a confession, or worse, a goodbye filled with emotion I wasn't ready to receive. When I finally opened it, it was simpler than I expected. A short note, just a few lines. He thanked me. For listening. For letting him see something real. He said he hoped I would keep writing, that the words I carried were worth more than I allowed myself to believe. And that he wouldn't forget the way the ocean sounded from the porch at dusk. I folded the note carefully and placed it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. There was something peaceful about the way he had gone. No drama, no pleading. Just quiet departure. A chapter that had written itself to its natural end. The rest of the day moved slowly. I cleaned. I reorganized drawers that didn't need reorganizing. I changed the sheets on the guest bed, even though no one would be sleeping there. I needed movement, small tasks that reminded me I still had control over something. Late in the afternoon, I took a walk down the hill toward the beach. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. The sky remained overcast, but the air was warm, heavy with the scent of wet pine and salt. The tide was low when I reached the shore. I slipped off my shoes and let my feet sink into the sand. The cold surprised me, jolted something awake. I walked along the waterline, letting the waves kiss my ankles, one after the other. The rhythm of the sea had always comforted me, long before any of this began. Its endless return, its refusal to be anything but what it was. I sat on a large flat rock, knees tucked to my chest, and looked out at the horizon. I thought about my husband, where he was at that moment, what he was doing, if he sensed the shift in me. We hadn't spoken in days. I hadn't reached out, and neither had he. That was the pattern we had learned, distance mistaken for respect, silence mistaken for peace. I didn't hate him. That thought settled over me gently. I didn't resent him for the years of quiet neglect. He had simply stopped seeing me. And I had stopped asking to be seen. But now, something was different. Not because of what had happened, but because of what I had remembered. That I was still capable of feeling, of wanting, of choosing. As I walked back up the hill, shoes in hand, the house came into view through the trees. It looked different now. Not haunted, not wounded, just quieter. Like a place that had heard too many stories and was waiting for the next one to begin. I spent the evening in the living room with the windows open, letting the night air drift through. I lit a candle on the coffee table, something I hadn't done in years. Not for the scent, but for the ritual. For the soft flicker of light in a space that had too long been dimmed. I pulled the notebook from the dresser and wrote again. This time not about him. Not about my husband. But about myself. I wrote about the way the sea looked when the sky was gray. About the way my hands felt in the soil. About the moment I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to feel whole. I didn't try to make sense of it all. I just captured what was real, what was mine. By the time I finished, the candle had nearly burned out. I closed the notebook, stretched my legs, and exhaled a long, slow breath. There was no resolution yet. No decision. Just a sense that I was finally standing in my life with both feet. No longer paused. No longer pretending. That night, I fell asleep with the windows open again. The air smelled of rain and lavender, and somewhere in the distance, the ocean kept breathing. It didn't ask questions. It didn't explain itself. It just moved. And so would I. The sound of a distant car door closing pulled me from a half-sleep, the kind of light drifting rest where thoughts blur with memory. I sat up slowly, blinking against the pale morning light that slipped through the thin curtains. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. The silence of the house felt different again, not emptier, but paused. As if it were holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. I didn't rush. I got up with deliberate calm, pulling on a sweater and stepping into the hallway. My bare feet padded softly against the wooden floor as I moved to the front of the house. I opened the door just in time to see him standing on the porch, a small bag slung over his shoulder, hair damp from the morning fog. He looked at me with an unreadable expression, part apology, part question, part something I couldn't name. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He stepped inside quietly, as if unsure of his welcome. I stepped aside without hesitation, and he entered like someone returning to a room that hadn't been locked, only left unlit. Neither of us filled the silence right away. He dropped the bag gently near the staircase and stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room like he was looking for something that had changed. I gestured toward the kitchen without a word, and he followed. The light in the room was soft, spilling in through the window over the sink, catching on the edges of the ceramic mugs left out from the night before. I put on the kettle, my hands moving out of habit, and he sat at the small table, the way he always had. We didn't talk about why he left. Or why he came back. When the tea was ready, I set the mug in front of him and took my seat across the table. The silence between us wasn't tense, it was reflective, careful. Like standing on the edge of something you're not yet sure you want to jump into. His voice broke the stillness. I didn't mean to stay away so long. I just needed to think. I nodded once. That much I understood. He looked up at me then, not with the uncertainty of someone asking forgiveness, but with the quiet bravery of someone willing to be honest. I thought leaving would make everything simpler. But it didn't. It just made it quieter. His words hung in the air between us, and I felt their weight. I could feel my pulse at the base of my throat, steady but strong. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence answer for both of us. Later, I walked down to the shoreline while he stayed behind. I didn't ask him to come. I needed space, not distance. The air was warmer than it had been the past few days, and the sky was a soft, uninterrupted blue. The tide had come in, reaching farther up the sand, erasing all the footprints from yesterday. I stood at the edge of the water, arms crossed over my chest, staring at the place where sea met sky. It felt like standing on a line that wasn't meant to be crossed, yet here I was, on the edge of things again. I thought of my husband, of the life we had built together. The dinners and anniversaries and quiet, steady rhythm of years that had held me like a soft, unchanging current. There was safety in that, comfort even, but somewhere along the way, I had disappeared inside it. And now? Now there was him. A presence that wasn't safe, wasn't predictable. Not because he threatened what I had, but because he reminded me of everything I'd stopped asking for. When I returned to the house, I found him outside, sitting on the back steps with the same sketchbook I had seen him with before. He closed it quickly when he saw me. I didn't ask what he'd been drawing. I never did. I sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder, but not quite touching. We watched the trees move in the breeze, the sun flickering through the branches. Minutes passed like that, wordless, still, dense with meaning. Then, quietly, I reached for his hand. Not out of impulse. Not out of loneliness. Out of certainty. We spent the night together. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't romantic. It was human. It was quiet and honest and warm. It was the kind of closeness that had nothing to do with the world outside and everything to do with what it means to be seen without question. In the morning, I woke before him. The house was bathed in golden light, and the air smelled like salt and lemon from the candle I'd forgotten to blow out. I lay there for a moment, listening to the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel regret. I felt present. Fully, unshakably present in my own skin. I got up, pulled a blanket over my shoulders, and stepped outside onto the porch. The world looked the same. The garden was still overgrown, the sea still murmured beyond the hill, the sky still carried the same soft promise of a new day. But something in me had shifted. Not because of what had happened. But because I had allowed it. I had said yes, not to him, not even to the moment, but to myself. And whatever came next, I would not be afraid. The following morning unfolded with a quiet, almost indifferent light. No dramatic sunrise, no golden rays slicing through the windows, just a soft, persistent gray that dulled the edges of everything. I stood in the kitchen stirring tea without really tasting it, listening to the kettle cool. He was still asleep upstairs, and I let the stillness stretch. There was a strange comfort in knowing he was there, and yet at the same time, a growing awareness that his presence wouldn't fix anything. Whatever had passed between us the night before hadn't erased the years that came before it, nor the questions waiting in the silence that followed. It had been real and intimate and human. But it was not an answer. I stepped outside with my mug and let the screen door close quietly behind me. The air was damp, filled with the smell of moss and morning. The garden was wet with dew, the leaves heavy, the earth soft. I sat on the edge of the porch, drawing my knees close, and stared down at the winding path that led toward the hill, toward the sea. Everything felt slower now. Not in a heavy way, but in the way time does when something important has already happened. You stop anticipating, and instead just observe. The wind carried the rustling of trees like whispers in a language I'd once understood but hadn't spoken in years. He came out an hour later, his hair tousled, his expression unreadable but gentle. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He sat a few feet away, the wood creaking under his weight, and stared at the same horizon I'd been watching all morning. We spent the better part of the day like that, parallel. Together, but separate. Moving through the house like two people who had crossed a threshold but weren't sure what door they were standing in front of now. He helped me fold laundry, tidy up the back room, rearrange the chairs in the living room that had been crooked for years. We spoke in fragments. What do you want for lunch? Should we open a window? Is this drawer stuck? But avoided anything resembling the night before. And maybe that was mercy. Maybe it was avoidance. Maybe it was both. Around midday, he offered to make a grocery run. I agreed, handing him a short list. When he left, I stood by the kitchen window and watched his car disappear down the winding road. A strange emptiness moved through me, not longing, but something more like distance catching up. I knew he'd be back in an hour, but part of me felt like he was already further than that. While he was gone, I opened the closet in the guest room. His things were still there, the canvas bag, a folded sweatshirt, the book he never finished. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at them. They didn't feel like intrusions. They felt like reminders of what had been easy, what had felt awake. I didn't touch any of it. I just let it exist. Like I was learning to let my own feelings exist, without trying to control them into tidy shapes. He returned with the groceries and a loaf of bread from the bakery in town. We made sandwiches in silence. Not the silence of tension, but the kind you fall into when there's nothing left to prove. We ate on the porch again. This time, the sun had finally broken through the clouds, scattering warm light across the floorboards. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw the kindness in his eyes, the patience in his posture, the youth that no longer intimidated me, because I finally understood it had never been about age. It had been about attention. About presence. About the way he had looked at me like I was still worth looking at. After we cleared the plates, I told him I was going for a walk alone. He nodded without hesitation, without guilt. That meant more to me than I could say. I followed the familiar trail toward the woods behind the house. It was a path I'd taken countless times over the years, often with my husband, often alone. Today it felt different, not because of the trees or the light or the air, but because I had changed. The person moving through the woods now wasn't the same woman who had come here to escape routine. She was someone who had stopped hiding inside it. The forest was alive with sound, birds, insects, the distant snapping of twigs under unseen feet. I walked slowly, letting my fingers trail along the bark of the trees, my palms brushing ferns and damp leaves. Every step forward felt like something uncoiling inside me. When I reached the old wooden bench by the clearing, I sat. The wood was damp and cool, but I didn't mind. I needed to be still. To listen to something other than my thoughts. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm that wasn't dependent on anyone else. I wasn't waiting for someone to arrive, or speak, or hold me. I wasn't hoping for resolution. I was simply existing in the moment, grounded in the knowledge that I had finally stepped back into my life. When I returned to the house, twilight was already beginning its slow descent. He was in the kitchen, washing dishes, sleeves rolled up, shoulders relaxed. He looked at me and smiled softly, as if to say, "You're back." And I was. But not just physically. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "We should talk soon," I said, my voice steady. He nodded. "I know. We didn't talk that evening. Not fully. We played cards. We listened to music. We sat in the living room with the windows open and let the cool air remind us that change was always possible." Before going to bed, I looked around the house. The floorboards I had once hated for creaking, the chipped tiles by the sink, the uneven shelf in the hallway, all of it felt different now. Not fixed. Not new. But seen. Accepted. In the mirror before sleep, I examined my face, not for age, not for beauty, but for truth. I saw a woman who had stepped outside the lines drawn for her. Who had allowed herself to want something. To feel something. To change. And whatever the next morning brought, I would meet it standing. Awake. And unafraid. The following day arrived without drama, without declaration, just light creeping steadily across the floorboards, pulling the house out of its sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, the scent of chamomile rising but never quite reaching me. I watched the steam fade into the air as if it were taking something of me with it. He was upstairs, still asleep, and I was trying to make sense of what remained. It wasn't guilt. That had never settled in the way I once feared it would. Nor was it joy, exactly. There was no elation, no triumphant sense of reclaiming myself. What I felt was quieter, stillness with weight, like the surface of a pond undisturbed but deep with meaning. I looked around the kitchen, tracing the edges of things I had long taken for granted, the nick in the wooden counter where a knife had slipped years ago, the curtain tie my husband had replaced with twine, the old ceramic bowl we never used but kept for sentiment. Each item whispered its history, none of it dramatic, but all of it mine. Eventually, I moved to the living room and opened the windows. The breeze was soft, tentative, carrying with it the scent of salt and late summer. I heard birds in the distance and the low hum of the sea. The house breathed with me, and I felt the peculiar ache of knowing it would soon go quiet again. When he came downstairs, he looked unsure of how to greet me. His eyes lingered just long enough to ask a silent question, one I wasn't ready to answer. I offered him coffee, and he accepted it with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We moved around each other gently, like people who had shared something meaningful but had woken up in different worlds. The conversation, when it came, was light. What groceries we still had. Whether the weather would hold. The garden. The lemon tree. All the words that formed a thin veil over what neither of us was ready to name. I spent most of the day outside, tending to the plants along the back edge of the property. He joined me for a while, helping carry compost and trim back the overgrowth, but there was distance now, necessary, maybe even kind. We worked in parallel, offering each other the unspoken gift of space. At one point, I found myself kneeling in the soil, fingers buried deep in the earth, pulling weeds that had wrapped themselves tightly around the base of the lavender. I tugged until my hands ached, until the sun had shifted behind the trees. There was something strangely satisfying about it, unraveling what didn't belong, what had grown wild and unnoticed. Later, we walked together to the edge of the bluff. The sea was calm, a flat silver stretching endlessly toward the sky. He stood beside me, silent, respectful. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. It wasn't avoidance, it was understanding. When we turned back, the house looked small from a distance, tucked into the slope like a secret. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of returning to it alone. That whatever had awakened in me wouldn't vanish once he was gone. It had taken root. That evening, I wrote again. Not a letter. Not even a reflection. Just a simple entry. A record of the day. Of what I had done. Of what I had not said. Of the steadiness I had found without asking for it. I wrote that I was tired, not exhausted, but full. The kind of tired that follows deep work, both physical and emotional. The kind of tired that doesn't ask for rest, but for acknowledgement. Afterward, I lit a candle and let the shadows stretch around the room. He was reading in the armchair across from me, and I watched him for a while. He looked younger than he had when he arrived. Or maybe I just saw him differently now. Less like a possibility and more like a mirror. Because that's what he had been, in the end, not a replacement, not an escape, but a reflection. Of what I had forgotten. Of who I still was. Before going to bed, I gathered a few of his things and placed them neatly on the dresser in the guest room. Not to rush him. Not to imply anything. Just to prepare. The moment of departure always comes, even when you don't name it aloud. That night, I stood at the window for a long time. The moon was full, washing the trees and garden in pale light. I could hear the sea again, softer now, like a lullaby. And I felt something settle inside me, not certainty, but acceptance. I no longer needed to understand everything. I didn't need to categorize what had happened, or what hadn't, or what still might. I had lived through a shift. A quiet earthquake. And I was still standing. I pulled the covers over me and closed my eyes. The wind moved gently through the open window. And I slept without waiting for anything. The morning I decided to leave the sea house was quiet in a way that felt ceremonial. The sky was a flat, cloudless blue, as though it had been cleared just for this purpose. I woke up before the sun fully rose, the house still wrapped in the hush of early light. There was no movement upstairs, no sound from the trees, not even the usual birdsong that had kept me company for the past weeks. It was as if everything paused to let me move. I dressed slowly, folding each piece of clothing with care before placing it into the suitcase. There wasn't much to pack. I had come here light and would leave even lighter, but not in the way I expected. I wasn't leaving empty, I was leaving changed. I made one last cup of tea and drank it on the porch. The air carried the scent of pine and salt and something softer, something almost sweet. I watched the shadows of the garden stretch across the ground and felt a strange sense of stillness in my chest, like the dust had finally settled after a long storm. He came downstairs just as I zipped the suitcase closed. His hair was still damp from the shower, and he wore the same soft expression I had come to recognize, quiet, observing, without pressure. We didn't greet each other. We didn't need to. The space between us was filled with everything we hadn't said, and somehow that felt more honest than words. He helped carry my bag to the car. We didn't speak as we walked, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. At the door, I paused, hand on the frame, and took one last look inside. The furniture. The open notebook on the table. The chipped bowl near the sink. It all looked the same, but it wasn't. Because I wasn't. When we reached the car, I placed the bag in the trunk and closed it with a soft click. I turned to him, searching for something final to say, and realized I didn't want a conclusion. What we had shared didn't require a label or a tidy goodbye. It had served its purpose. He looked at me with something close to gratitude, and I nodded, offering my own in return. "Take care of the house," I said. "I will." I didn't promise to return, and he didn't ask. That, too, felt like respect. The drive down the coastal road was peaceful, the winding turns familiar by now. I let the windows down and allowed the breeze to thread through my hair. My hands rested lightly on the wheel, the radio off, the only sound the rhythm of tires against asphalt and the occasional cry of gulls above the cliffs. I stopped once, halfway through the drive, at a quiet overlook. The bench there faced the sea, and I sat for a while, letting the horizon settle into my bones. There was no urgency in me. No need to rush forward or look back. I was simply still. Present. Unfolded. By the time I reached home, our home, the sun had shifted, casting the city in golden light. Everything looked sharper here. Louder. More alive. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The house welcomed me with its usual scent, linen, old wood, a faint trace of my husband's cologne that still clung to the hallway. He was in the kitchen when I entered. Reading the newspaper, his glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up and gave a small, surprised smile, as if he hadn't expected me back so soon. "You're home early," he said. I nodded, set my bag down gently. "I wanted to come back today." He offered to make tea, and I accepted. We didn't talk much. He asked if everything had gone well. I said yes. I didn't mention the boy, the sea, the notebook. He didn't ask about any of it. Our conversation floated on the surface, careful and easy, like people who knew the language of one another but no longer used it fully. Later, I unpacked slowly. Placed my folded clothes back into the drawers, hung my coat by the door. I stood in the middle of the living room, surveying the space. It hadn't changed. And yet it felt different in my presence now. As if it sensed I'd stepped back into it with new awareness. That night, I sat alone on the balcony while my husband went to bed early. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. I opened my notebook and began to write, not about the past few weeks, not about him, but about the quiet discoveries I'd made. I wrote about the way rain sounds on the roof when you're listening. About how lavender bends under its own weight. About how sometimes, presence isn't about being seen, but about seeing yourself clearly for the first time. I wrote until my fingers ached and the air turned cold. Then I closed the notebook and went inside. In the days that followed, life resumed its rhythm. The routine. The phone calls. The dinners. The small, polite laughter. But underneath it all was a steadiness I hadn't known I was capable of. I didn't tell my husband what happened. Not because I wanted to lie. But because the truth wasn't something he needed to carry, it was something I had already accepted. And the truth was simple. I had stepped away from my life long enough to remember it was mine. And now I had returned, not to continue where I left off, but to begin from where I stood now. Not a wife, not a mother, not a reflection of who I used to be. Just a woman. Alive. Whole. And finally awake.